Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony LeBlanc, and today I'm in conversation with Professor Richard Conder, and we're continuing our final insight into Winston Churchill, and it will stretch across the period 1940 to 1965. Now, one thing you need to bear in mind, if you haven't seen the previous two episodes, they are available on the Tony at 12 YouTube channel. Richard, good to see you.
Hi, Tony. Good to be back.
Well, what could we do without you? You're looking very fit and well and everything else.
Yeah.
We left Churchill, didn't we, at the point last time where he'd just effectively taken over as Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And
10th of May 1940, yeah.
Yeah. And so we're into the era of being a war leader. I think a lot of people know a lot of things probably about the war. So if we can keep to sort of more or less bullet points on it, I think that would be useful. One thing I did want to ask you, though, people have sort of said we didn't win the war. It was the Americans that won the war with our help. But we certainly did a fairly good opening batsman stage, didn't we, for a couple of years?
Yeah, I think that is very true. That we neither had the United Kingdom, Great Britain, neither had the manpower, the financial reserves or the physical reserves to take on the might of the Wehrmacht and Nazi Germany on its own. And once France was out of the war, it really was a matter of just sustaining opposition to Nazi Germany and until a coalition of allies could be built to take on the might of the Axis powers, Japan, Italy, and Nazi Germany, and defeat them. But the reality is, as Churchill said, Hitler could not win the war without defeating the Great Britain.
Yeah.
And because Great Britain was a great naval power, great sea power, probably still the greatest in the world in 1940, and could command the sea lanes and effectively put a blockade on Nazi Germany and Italy in the Mediterranean on its own during that period, 1940 to 1941, June 1941, when Russia came into the war after they were attacked, and December 1941, when the United States came in. So Great Britain was the only Allied power that could offer resistance and challenge what up to then had been an unbroken period of success, particularly for Nazi Germany. Hitler had developed the tactic of taking one country on after another, never fighting on two fronts, and had successfully separated neutral powers and the belligerent powers one after another. So holding out against him and continuing to attack them and as I say, blockade Nazi Germany and attack and have minor attacks. And of course there was the air battle as well, which is very significant as a quasi second front, the bombing of Nazi Germany. The United Kingdom, Great Britain did that on its own. So it was a critically important part. It would be very difficult to imagine the United States being able to take on Nazi Germany without Great Britain still being in the war.
Yeah. Of course, we had this problem with Dunkirk, didn't we? Lost quite a few men there, left a load of kit behind. Was that before or after Churchill took over?
No, if we just briefly deal with that, I'm conscious of time, but of course Churchill took over on 10th of May 1940, which just happened to be the very same day that Nazi Germany attacked France and Belgium and Holland and Belgium in that order. And so he was immediately faced by the French, the inability of the French army to defend France and to sustain the attack, the blitzkrieg of the Panzers. And of course, Holland and Belgium were never able to offer concerted and significant resistance. So the British Army, which was quite small on the expeditionary force, which was just holding really the Belgian border, was very quickly outflanked by the German army coming through the Ardennes, which was thought to be impenetrable, but it wasn't, and outflanking them and sweeping up around the Somme and effectively encircling them, particularly once Belgium had capitulated and the left flank of the British army was open. And the French were simply not able to close the gap because basically they were in almost continual retreat. and the French generals were very, very poorly equipped to handle a very mobile war, which the Blitzkrieg was imposing upon them. So Churchill faced an immediate crisis. It's very often forgotten. He neither had the support of the whole of the Tory party. He wasn't Tory party leader in May 1940. He was prime minister. He had a divided cabinet. He had a number of senior members of his cabinet who would have entertained a peace overtures through Sweden to Nazi Germany. He had effectively a defeated British expeditionary force, which had to be brought back to the mainland. And he had a rampant Nazi Germany, and latterly, in May 1940, Italy declared war and was attacking France from the south as well. So the essential thing was to bring back the army in order to be able to defend the United Kingdom, Great Britain, from what was assumed to be the likelihood of a seaborne invasion from France and the Low Countries. Churchill knew, and the reality was, that the Nazi Germany was not a sea power. It was a land-based power, and the greatest land-based army in the world at the time. But it was not equipped for seaborne invasions. And the reality was that it was always going to be a huge challenge for Germany to successfully invade Great Britain. Now, Churchill probably knew that, but he, nonetheless, as President Kennedy said, he marshaled the English language and sent it to war through those amazing, wonderful speeches. And he persuaded the people of the country, probably more united than ever in their history before or since, to resist under all circumstances the potential invasion by Nazi Germany. So very quickly, what was called the local defence volunteers, which we know as the Home Guard, were brought together, more than 1 million men, unarmed at the time, but nonetheless ready to go to battle. And of course, 250,000 regular troops were brought back as well, without their armour, but still sufficiently capable of fighting, because they had their sidearms and their rifles and so on. And very quickly, the whole economy was geared up to produce munitions and ammunition to resist a potential invasion. And the people, not least as a result of the very dynamic leadership of Churchill, were ready and determined to resist.
Now, what interests me is that despite the fact that the Great Britain's at war with Germany, they're still able to start thinking about social reforms. And, we've sort of look at Beveridge, for example, and Butler with the Education Act in 1944. Quite incredible that despite the fact that, it's all hands to the pumps on the war itself, that you can actually consider the future.
Well, I think that is a huge tribute, not just to Churchill, but to his cabinet as a whole. I have to remember it was a coalition government, and he had some very, very great figures in his cabinet. Attlee, Bevin, Ernest Bevin, Stafford Cripps, and equally a number of liberal-minded Tories. But a huge sea change from what had been the Tory leadership in the 1930s. So yes, they realised that at the end of the war, things would not go on and could not go on in the way in social care, education that they had gone in the 1930s. I think it'd be true to say that Churchill was so focused on winning the war, he pretty much left domestic policy to other members of the cabinet, such as Butler, who had had a checkered history in terms of supporting Churchill in the late 1930s and in the early days of Churchill's government. But Churchill was not a man to hold grudges. And Beveridge, an academic, was tasked with producing this report on the future social care, education, partly education, hospitals, housing for a post-war Britain. And he brought out this major report, which basically gave the pathway for what the country would look like post-war. And Churchill, to his great credit, and it's a speech that's not very often heard, gave a very powerful speech, one of his radio speeches, as a result of the Beveridge report, where he talked about needing to wipe away the old school tie, wipe away privilege, open university education to everybody who could benefit from it, ensure that everybody was able to feed themselves properly and had the opportunity to work to better themselves. And it was a very, very powerful speech, and I've listened to it a number of times, very, very rarely reported, and almost sounded like a sort of a modern day middle of the road, well, probably not today, but a 1960s modern conservative. What Disraeli would have called a one nation conservative.
That's interesting.
Which belied the whole idea of him being aristocratic and privileged, all of which he was. But he had a real feel for what he called the ordinary man in his cottage.
We're going to skip through the battles and essentially go straight on to the victory, which was really something else, wasn't it?
Yeah, and of course, Churchill's, we talked about the Great Britain being alone. Churchill's huge contribution, well, one of the many things he did, was to ensure that ultimately America had to come into the war.
Yeah.
And he built and held together the alliance with Russia, which was effectively fighting the land war, and from a junior position, a very weak position. Great Britain was not an equal partner with Russia and America, either in terms of arms, finances, a number of soldiers they could put into the field. But he held that alliance together, and the victory was probably as much Churchill's victory, if we're talking about personalities, as anybody else's. And he had such a huge strategic understanding of what was likely to happen post-war, what needed to be done in order to ensure victory. He saw the dangers of a rampant Soviet Union in the East post-war. He warned against that. He was very concerned about President Roosevelt's, if you like, cozying up to Joseph Stalin and giving away too much, which of course did ultimately lead to the Iron Curtain and Poland and most of Eastern Europe being dominated by the Soviet Union for many, many years. So he had enormous strategic insight, and the victory, I think it'd be fair to say it would have been very difficult for the Allies, for Great Britain certainly to have won the war, and for that strategic alliance to have held together without the impact and the vision that Churchill showed in leading the country and leading the alliance through 5 years of war.
Now, of course, at the end of the war, all the servicemen come back to England, to the United Kingdom, and unfortunately, he loses power at that point.
Yeah, that's interesting, Tony, when you say unfortunately. I'll come to that in a minute. I think actually it was inevitable. And you have to look back through the prism of history to understand that, I think. But the ordinary people of the country had suffered enormous deprivation during the latter part of the 19th, well, right the way through the 1930s. They were taken into a war by a conservative leadership, which effectively told them that appeasement was the answer, that tried to reach accommodation with the Nazis. And then they were plunged into a war which they had to fight.
Yeah,
the
sure.
Ordinary, now, no matter how well led they were and inspired they were by Churchill, the reality was that to the ordinary man and woman on the street, the war was seen as a conservative war. And of course, it's apocryphal, but many people say they wanted Churchill as the Prime Minister and the Labour Party as the governing party. I don't think that was the case. But I think, and of course, a lot of education had gone on in the war in terms of people coming together in the forces and starting to realise the levels of inequality in society that had existed in the war, in the country in the 20s and 30s. Of course, if you go back to the First World War, Lloyd George's answer of a land fit for heroes, which actually turned out to be the Depression and mass unemployment, they weren't going to see that again. The voters were not going to allow that to happen again. And the Labour Party offered up the vision of a much more egalitarian opportunities for all of society. And of course, the other bit, in terms of the unfortunate part of him losing, we have to remember he was utterly exhausted at the end of the war, as was most of his cabinet. I think it's easy to forget the war killed Roosevelt. Stalin was very, very ill and unfit. Churchill was utterly exhausted. You look at pictures of him in 1940 and 1945.
Yeah, different
And of
man.
course, Clementine Churchill said, perhaps it's a blessing in disguise, the defeat. And he said, well, if it's disguised, it's very well disguised. But actually, it probably was for him, the Tory party, and many members of the cabinet who had worked in terms of human terms, beyond the call of duty, and had absolutely exhausted themselves. So it was probably the right time. And of course, we're going to come to the 1945 election and his infamous Gestapo jibe at Attlee and the Labour Party, which was nonsense and showed very poor judgment. And also, I think, part of his utter exhaustion, having lived and fought the war every moment of the day for 5 years. So the defeat in 1945, which was a huge defeat, the Labour Party majority was massive, I think was inevitable. In terms of himself, it probably saved his life. I don't think he could have gone on. I don't think he was equipped mentally to step back from fighting a war to taking on the responsibilities of rebuilding a society. And of course, in terms of the Gestapo jibe, the people he was accusing, very foolishly of that, were people he had worked hand in glove with. Attlee, Ernest Bevan, Stafford Cripps, the names I've mentioned before. These were his comrades and friends, and throughout the war. So it was very foolish. I don't think it was the reason he lost the election.
No,
I think James Callaghan said that sometimes the winds of change are so powerful that nothing a political leader can do can change them. He was talking about when he lost to Margaret Thatcher in 1979. It was just the same in 45. If Churchill couldn't win an election in 45, nobody could have done for the Conservatives. And it was one of those seminal moments in political history when a change was necessary. And it was probably, and of course, the 1945-51 Labour government was one of the probably greatest governments of the century in terms of what it did in terms of rebuilding society.
But what it did had already been formulated.
Yes.
The Beveridge Report,
yes.
and with the Butler Education Act and things like that. You know, they weren't working from a clean sheet of paper.
No, they weren't. The blueprint was there. The coalition government had put that blueprint together.
Yeah.
And so yes, they were ready to go with effectively a National Health Service and a completely new system of primary and secondary education.
How did Churchill face up to opposition then?
Well, different times. We have to remember. Basically, he was a part-time leader of the opposition. Would be a generous way of saying it. I mean, he lived. He certainly had to recover his strength.
Yeah.
He made occasional forays into the political world, but he spent a lot of time writing, mostly his history of the Second World War, for which he made a huge fortune, speaking and traveling and being on holiday. And you could do that in those days. So he had Anthony Eden as his deputy leading the opposition. He had some very, very powerful colleagues in the House who would lead on various parts of the opposition's agenda. But to a large extent, he was opposition with a light touch.
Yeah.
He had a huge presence on the international scene in his own right, but very, very difficult to think of too many major interventions that he made during the period 1945 to 50, certainly, which are memorable. And certainly in British domestic policy, the Conservatives had to completely rebuild their infrastructure and their philosophy. And the Conservative Research Group, with people like Enoch Powell, yes, again, Rab Butler, Harold Macmillan, people like that, rebuilt the Conservative Party's philosophy very much on a late 20th century model, where a lot of what the Labour Party had put in place were accepted and were never going to be changed.
Was he pro-Europe?
Well, whichever side you're on the European debate, that you can claim Churchill as your mentor. Certainly in terms of the European mainland, he saw the absolute necessity for bringing particularly France and Germany together in some sort of alliance, permanent structural alliance. And he made a famous speech at Strasbourg. I think it was in 1948, but I probably got that date wrong. Where he basically posited the whole idea of a European Union. So that, and because the world had gone through two major European civil wars in the previous 30, 40 years, and it could never happen again. And so he was very, very generous. He was very generous to Germany. He said, Germany has to be a part of this new alliance. This is not about punishing them as they did in Versailles in 1918, 1919. So those who claim that Churchill was a true European claim the Strasbourg speech as their justification. But of course, he was also dedicated to the Atlantic Alliance, the relationship between the United States and Great Britain. So those who would claim Churchill as being a Brexiteer, if you like, would claim that he always wanted to be a part of Europe, but outside of Europe, because he believed what he called the English-speaking alliance was more important.
The old empire plus the Americans.
Well, the English. Yes, he always, in his wartime speeches, he always talked about the English-speaking alliance, and difficult to know really where he would sit on this. Things have moved on so far now. I suspect it's impossible to say where his views would have been. But he was, of course, we have to remember, which we haven't mentioned, in 1940, that May where we started, May 1940. He envisaged, along with the French Prime Minister, a union of France and Great Britain to keep France in the war as France was being defeated in May 1940. And it was actually passed by Parliament that we're a permanent alliance, a permanent one nation of France and Great Britain. But of course, France went down very quickly after that. But that would have been your early European Union. But I think it only lasted a matter of days.
Okay, so despite all the efforts of the Labour Party, the fickle electorate reinstate Churchill in 1951. What had the Labour Party done not to have got a second term then?
Well, we need to remember it. Actually, they did get a second term. Churchill lost the 1950 election.
Right.
That was at the end of the 5-year term.
Yeah.
But the reality is, Tony, just to say, Attlee's government was itself exhausted. It had run out of steam, and its majority, which was say 150 odd, fell to something like about 9.
Right.
In 1950. And they were returned for a second term, but with a hugely reduced majority. And it was clear that Stafford Cripps had died, Ernest Bevan had died, Attlee himself was exhausted. Aaron Bevan was causing enormous splits on the left of the Labour Party.
Some things never change.
So the Attlee government, really, Churchill and his senior colleagues knew that the Attlee government was going to stagger on for a few. The second Attlee government for a few months. Did actually manage for about 18 months. It lasted, I think, about 18 months, but it was a lame duck really. So the 1951 election came in. Churchill didn't score a huge majority. I think it was about 17 or 18 majority, which in those days was perfectly enough to govern with.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a landslide. But it was essentially the Labour Party had a very, very tough time. I mean, they'd had to deal with post-war rebuilding. They'd had to implement the National Health Service. They'd had the Korean War. They'd had the Berlin airlift. And they had essentially just run out of steam and run out of personalities. I mean, there was a new generation coming through like Hugh Gaitskell and Harold Wilson, people like that, but they hadn't really established themselves at that stage. So Churchill, at a very advanced age, well into his mid-late 70s, and not in good shape. I mean, he'd lived a tough life and enjoyed all the fruits of his life and of his success. He was a very different man in 1951. And Clementine Church certainly would have wanted him to retire very early on. So he formed a government which was quite different to his action-led government in 1940. He brought in a lot of his old friends and cronies. Lord Alexander came in, I think, as Minister of Defence. A whole group of his friends came in as ministers. Macmillan was there as Minister of Housing. Butler was Chancellor of the Exchequer. And Eden, of course, was Foreign Secretary and the leader in waiting. But he himself was very ill as well. So it was instead of being a full action driven government, again, Churchill continued to take quite a back seat. His big drive, his big passion was to prevent another war.
Yeah.
He was very, very anxious about nuclear weapons, about the threat of Russia, and he identified very early on the need for a summit and détente between Russia and the West. The Korean War was still going on. Berlin airlift had only just been resolved. Stalin died in 1952, but Stalin was still there when he came into power in 1951. So he saw the threat of a nuclear holocaust as a very, very serious threat. And most of he did, again, very little on domestic policy. Most of his energies were devoted to trying to bring together the Soviet Union, America, and Great Britain. Still, Great Britain taking a leading role in this tripartite discussions to try to resolve the threat of nuclear weapons. In that, he was largely unsuccessful, mostly because Eisenhower, the president of the United States from 1952, was very suspicious of the Soviet Union and wanted very little to do with any attempts by Churchill to bring together the superpowers.
And was it Eisenhower obviously led the Allies, didn't he, in World War II?
As the military commander, he was the supreme leader in Europe.
Yeah. He was probably more able to sort of come to conclusions that perhaps Truman wouldn't have come to.
Yeah, I think certainly he had a lot of military background, and of course he was a Republican, and the Republicans are temperamentally more isolationist than the Democrats usually, and he was a relatively new president, and he wasn't a politician, so he felt very nervous in the early days of his presidency. He had Richard Nixon as his vice president, who had more experience, but Eisenhower was a very, very inexperienced politician. So he wasn't going to be rushed into some sort of discussions with the Soviet Union, of whom he knew very little. And post-1952, nobody knew who the leaders were. There was Khrushchev, Malenkov, Bulgarin, but nobody knew them. So you might say that Churchill was a man in a hurry, and Eisenhower wasn't in a hurry at all. So it wasn't going to happen. And of course, Churchill himself, as I said, was quite old even for his, well, perhaps not in those days, but these days you'd think he wasn't that old in his mid-70s, but his health was precarious, and he had a very, very significant stroke in 1952, I think it was 52 or 53, which basically, well, most medical opinion thought he was going to die within hours. In the event, he did recover his strength, and did over a period of many months. But basically the government was out without a formal leader for a number of months. Anthony Eden himself actually was hospitalized at just the same time, unfortunately. And so a collaboration of newspaper proprietors, doctors, and leading members of the Tory party basically hid the fact that he had a stroke and was completely incapacitated. And the government was run on the quiet by people like Butler and Christopher Soames, Churchill's son-in-law.
Couldn't do that today, could you?
No, a very different world then. Yeah, but typically utterly indefatigable.
Yeah,
he rebuilt his strength. He was able to give the leader's speech at his party congress that year, which was a very successful speech. He still had the ability to make rousing and brilliant speeches, which were worth listening to and are still quoted. And he still had a passion for, as I said, for international relations and peace. And it was actually a successful government, because although he was pretty much hands off on domestic affairs, they had a huge house building program. Macmillan built 300,000 houses a year, unprecedented. They got rid of rationing finally. I mean, you've never had it so good era of the 1950s started during that period. So it was on the domestic scene, you were starting to see the benefits of things like the National Health Service, things like improved schooling, building new schools, building new houses. The people started to be significantly better off than they ever had been before. So it was a successful administration. And he stood down in 1955, very reluctantly. There had been a lot of tension at the top of the Tory party. In 1955, he was 80. His potential successors like Eden, Macmillan, Butler were chafing at the bit to be allowed to realise their legacy. He kept putting off his retirement. So he very reluctantly went into retirement in April 1955, and Eden succeeded. And within weeks called an election. And not surprisingly, given what I just said about how much better off the country was and individual people were, as a result of Churchill's second administration, Eden won a swinging majority in May 1955, just a few weeks after becoming Prime Minister, succeeding Churchill. So, although it's called his Indian Summer, that second administration, and he wasn't the man he was in 1940 to 45, he nonetheless led a very successful government for whatever reason. A government of many talents, probably riding on the wave of post-war prosperity that come through austerity. But by any measure, it was a successful administration, as manifest in the 55 election.
Yeah.
So then he lived for another 10 years. He was obviously very reluctant to give up the leadership, very reluctant to cease being Prime Minister. But he then got on with another project called The History of the English-Speaking People, which he'd originally been commissioned to write in 1936, I think, in the 30s, but had been a bit busy to do it. So he wrote this amazing 4 or 5 part treatise called The History of the English-Speaking People, which is still in publication now. So that occupied him in the late 50s. He remained a member of Parliament, although increasingly, he remained a member of Parliament until 1964, but increasingly not really very active. And I think quite a sad picture to see a man, in such a giant of a man, in such physical decline, still attempting to appear in Parliament in the early 1960s in a wheelchair. But he was very, very reluctant to give up. I think basically he wanted to die in harness. I think that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to die as a member of Parliament. But he did make the occasional speech. He was, of course, in 1963, awarded honorary citizenship of the United States by President Kennedy. The only time that's ever been done, I think, up to then anyway. But
he was half American, Richard.
He was half American. And of course, a famous speech in Congress, he said, what did he say? He said, if my mother was American and my father was British, if it had been the other way round, I might have got to Congress on my own. And that was that he said when he was addressing Congress. So, so ultimately, he did ultimately become an American citizen.
Yeah.
I'm very conscious of our time, Tony, and I'm conscious of...
Well, that's okay, because, we had got this note down, relationship with his children.
Yes.
As far as that was concerned, that was a little... He just wanted Randolph to be successful, didn't he?
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. I think I'd like, if you will allow me, I'd like to reflect on his life and his career.
We've got another 10 minutes.
Sorry?
We've got another 10 minutes.
No, 10 minutes. So, as we know, as we said in our first discussion, his relationship with his own father was very fraught and very difficult. He wanted to have his father's approval, but his father was a very distant father. He instead was a very loving, indulgent father.
Yeah.
But his son Randolph, I think, was his only son, was hugely indulged, and consequently, I think Randolph had some of the brilliance of Churchill, but none of his restraint or his compassion. I think that would be fair to say. And he was a very, very difficult. The relationship was very challenging, very difficult, even right up to the end of Churchill's life, and quite sad in some ways. And I think Churchill was very indulgent towards Randolph and would have loved to have seen Randolph have his own parliamentary career, which he himself would have wanted, like a dynasty. So Lord Randolph Churchill was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Winston Churchill was the great parliamentarian. Randolph Churchill did eventually get into Parliament briefly in the war in an uncontested seat. So he did sit in Parliament briefly for a few years, but because they didn't contest elections, by-elections in the war. But he was swept away in the 1945 Labour victory and never got into Parliament again. He had 3 daughters. Well, he had 4 daughters, but very tragically, one of them died in childhood, Marigold. But his 3 daughters, Diana and Sarah, had interesting careers, in as much as they were, one was an actress, another was a writer, and also had difficulty in relationships. Mary, the youngest, was very happy, very stable, very successful, and he doted on Mary, I think, and she was very, very supportive. And she only died a few years ago, and has written a number of books about her father.
And of course,
the whole family. Sorry.
So I was going to say Nicholas Soames was her son.
Christopher Soames was her husband. Christopher Soames was a parliamentarian.
So they kept the parliamentary representation bit going.
Indeed. Nicholas Soames is a very great parliamentarian. Well, he was. He's not now. And a great tribute to Mary and Christopher and to Winston. Of course, Randolph Churchill's son, Winston Churchill, also was a parliamentarian and was Shadow Minister of Defence in when Mrs. Thatcher was in opposition. But again, didn't achieve cabinet office. I think the thing you can say about Winston Churchill, he was a very, very loving father to all of his children. And you can see pictures and films of them interrelating when they were children, and you can see there's this very busy, very, very multifaceted man, polymath. Nonetheless, his key, the biggest part of his life was his family.
It's interesting, isn't it, that where you have a generation where the father almost rejects the son, when it comes to his turn to be a father, works overtime to make sure that his kids have a reasonable existence.
And I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think we'll think of a number of examples of that.
So he died in 1965, and I suppose we all remember the funeral, don't we?
Interestingly, he died to the day 75 years after his own father died.
Incredible.
In January 1965. And the state funeral, the first state funeral since Wellington's state funeral. Few of us of our generation will ever forget it. Freezing cold. Was it January or February day? Freezing cold. All the great politicians from around the world there. The Queen, of course, attending, and those soldiers marching in their greatcoats and through London to support St Paul's Cathedral. Quite extraordinary. And then, of course, his coffin being borne on a launch down the Thames, and the cranes, the jibs bowing them as the launch went by.
And eventually to Waterloo, where he was taken by train to Blaydon.
Blaydon, yes.
Which is within, a view of Blenheim, isn't it? It's just down the road.
Yeah.
And
buried right next to his father and his mother in a tiny little parish church. And with Marigold, the daughter I mentioned, who died right next to them as well. A real, not showy or anything like that, but just an ordinary small English church, which of course is exactly what he would have wanted.
An incredible life, wasn't it? Really, looking back on it.
I mean, we've talked mostly about his politics, but almost by any measure, his life is almost without parallel, because he was a great author, written many seminal works about Duke of Marlborough, about the English, about the Great War, the Second World War. He was a soldier who was in the last cavalry charge of the British Army. He was a painter of an artist of extraordinary skill. Walter Sickert, I think president of the Royal Society, Churchill put two of his oil paintings in anonymously into a competition with the Royal Society, and they were selected. And Walter Sickert said that these are of a very, very high standard, and he didn't know it was Churchill's.
Yeah.
So an artist of real merit, and of course, probably one of the greatest orators of history.
Yeah.
If I may, I mean, I've got a couple of quotes here, which
yeah, please do.
I've mentioned before Roy Jenkins' biography of Churchill.
Yeah.
One of the many, and he wrote the very last paragraph in his book. He said, of more importance than a comparison of the different obsequies is a judgment between Gladstone, undoubtedly the greatest prime minister of the 19th century, and Churchill, undoubtedly the greatest of the 20th century. When I started writing this book, this is Roy Jenkins, when I started writing this book, I thought Gladstone was, by a narrow margin, the greater man, certainly the more remarkable specimen of humanity. In the course of writing it, I have changed my mind. I now put Churchill, with all his idiosyncrasies, indulgences, his occasional childishness, but also his genius, his tenacity, and his persistent ability, right or wrong, successful or unsuccessful, to be larger than life, as the greatest human being ever to occupy 10 Downing Street.
That's one. Yeah.
So I think that's a Labour politician who's written about Churchill. I think I probably would go further than that, and there would be claims to who is the greatest Englishman, and many people put different cases. I mean, the Duke of Marlborough himself could be one, not English person. Let's not say Englishman. Queen Elizabeth would be another possibly. Then Alexander Fleming, great scientists and great artists. Shakespeare, of course. But I certainly, having read almost every book I suspect that's been written about Churchill, and in terms of the overall man and his compassion and his humanity, I think it's difficult to make a case that there is any greater English person, British person in history who we could identify, who is easy to identify, because of the whole man. Mary Soames, who we mentioned, said, because there are obviously critics and revisionist historians who will want to describe him as a racist and judging him by today's standards, and of course everybody has to be reconsidered and reviewed in terms of their judgments and decisions they make. He was a Victorian. He wasn't just a marginal Victorian. He was born in 1875, so he was a man of his time, and it's very difficult to judge people's views that they are influenced by the milieu in which they live. But for me, I think it's very difficult to think of an individual who stands above him in terms of his achievements, his humanity, his belief in individuals, in liberty and in peace, and who made a greater contribution to Great Britain and probably the world than Churchill. But others would have a very different view. If I might, we didn't mention his Iron Curtain speech at Fulton in 1946, and there's so much, but normally that speech in 1946 in Missouri in the United States with President Truman in attendance, are remembered for him talking about an Iron Curtain coming down across Europe from Trieste to right across and occupying or taking out the whole of Eastern Europe. But another part of his speech, which is rarely quoted, is this: "The earth is a generous mother. She will provide in plentiful abundance food for all her children if they will but cultivate her soil in justice and peace." And I think that sums up in a very brief sentence what his whole philosophy was about: justice and peace for all mankind.
Richard, that's a super way of finishing it. Really enjoyed talking to you about it as ever, and you're going to be back on other subjects. But I think you've been able to look at Churchill comprehensively and without, sort of saying, I'm definitely think he's a good guy. We've looked at the warts and all, haven't we?
I think we have, and the warts are there.
Yeah.
Many, like all of us. Yeah.
Many thanks, Richard. Really appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Great to see you again. See you soon.
Good to see you soon.